Good morning. I'm really happy to be here at Circular Church in this video format, which is one of the new ways that we share in community with one another. And I'm really glad to be with you on this fourth Sunday of Easter as we continue to celebrate and ruminate on the meaning of the resurrection. This particular year, I've been thinking quite a bit about the wonderful poem by Wendell Berry, Manifesto, the Mad Farmer Liberation Front. It's the poem that ends with the words, practice resurrection. And so I want to read you just a little bit from the poem, a poem I'm sure that many of you are already familiar with, and back that up to the reading today from the book of Acts. So, friends, every day, do something that won't compute. Love the Lord, love the world, work for nothing. Take all that you have and be poor. Love somebody who does not deserve it. Denounce the government and embrace the flag. Hope to live in that free republic for which it stands. Give your approval to all you cannot understand. Praise ignorance, for what man has not encountered, he has not destroyed. Ask the questions that have no answers. Invest in the millennium. Plant sequoias. And then he goes on like that with lots of other things to do and ends the poem with the words, practice resurrection. I think we misunderstand that poem. When we hear those words, practice resurrection, the first thing we think of is, oh, I've got to get out and I've got to do all of these things in order to demonstrate that my life is somehow transformed by those events 2,000 years ago when the disciples proclaimed, he isn't here, he is risen, and that Jesus defeats even death. There was a book that was published several years ago, A History of American Protestantism. And the title of that book, I've never been able to get it out of my mind, is The Work We Have to Do. And that's what Protestants are like. Congregationalists and Lutherans and Baptists and Presbyterians and all of the different forms of Christianity, especially here in the United States, that aren't Catholic or Eastern Orthodox, is that we're busy. We think that faith is about grace. That's the basic sort of point of the gospel story, is that God saves the world. God saves us. Yet when it comes to faith, we're not really working our way to heaven, but it sure looks like it. Is that Protestants go out and do things. Protestants love cooking up projects, serving people, figuring out, what to do with their buildings, demonstrating their love of God by endless activity. And this poem by Wendell Berry seems to point there as well. Think of all of those things that he just listed. Do something every day that won't compute. Love the Lord, love the world, work for nothing. Take all you have and be poor. Love someone who does not deserve it. Denounce the government, embrace the flag. Hope to live in that free republic for which it stands. Give your approval to that which you don't understand. It sounds like a list of things to do. But what's really interesting about that famous poem is that it ends on a slightly different note. These are the last lines of it. Go with your love to the fields. Lie easy in the shade. Rest your head in her lap. Swear allegiance to what is nighest your thoughts. As soon as the generals and the politicos can predict the motions of your mind, lose it. Leave it as a sign to mark the false trail the way you didn't go. Be like the fox, who makes more tracks than necessary, some in the wrong direction. Practice resurrection. What doesn't always compute in this poem is that he lists all of these things, this manifesto of things to do, but then it ends on this other note, a note about lying easy in the fields, about embracing what is nearest in thought, offering up sort of confusing signs to a world who thinks that they can predict how we're going to act, and leave it as a false trail. Be like the fox. Practice resurrection. So even there, in this wonderful poem that so many people in churches like Circular have quoted often endlessly during the Easter season, we get an understanding of what it means to practice resurrection, to practice being an Easter people in a sort of a thoughtful, alternative manner. And that's what I want to think about with you today, related to some fairly familiar verses from the book of Acts. The lectionary today gives us verses that many people know. Indeed, some people laugh at these verses and refer to this as the text of socialist Christianity. They are as follows. From Acts chapter 2. They, that is the new believers who have just been baptized, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and fellowship, to the breaking of bread and prayers. Awe came upon everyone, because many wonders and signs were being done by the apostles. All who believed were together and held all things in common. They would sell their possessions and goods and distribute the proceeds to all as any had need. Day by day, as they spent much time together in the temple, they broke bread at home and ate their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having the goodwill of all the people. And day by day, the Lord added to their number and those who were being saved. Now, Wendell Berry gave us a manifesto for practicing resurrection. This text from the book of Acts is also a manifesto for practicing resurrection. And what I would like to reflect with you this morning is that it doesn't say what we sometimes think it says. If we think about these words from the book of Acts as being written somewhere between about 75 and 100. So this is a story that is written towards the end of the first century to reflect back on an episode that happens almost immediately after the resurrection. So we have the Easter events, we have the proclamation to the first of Jesus' friends, followers, and disciples that the Lord is no longer in the tomb, that the Lord is risen. And these appearances of Jesus that are all very interesting and odd and turn the lives of those whom he knew upside down. The experience of what happened on that Sunday, what happened all those years ago, changed all of the people who were involved in those events. And that early group of folks to whom these things occurred, they went out and started sharing this story with others. And so we get this tale, this remembrance in the book of Acts from an episode that happens during the feast of Pentecost, what becomes known as Pentecost in the Christian church. And a whole lot of people hear Jesus' friends telling the story of what happened with the resurrection, and they come to also believe, and they're baptized. So those people, having heard the story in this sort of second wave of telling this story of the resurrection, begin immediately to live differently. In effect, they hear about the resurrection, they get baptized, and they begin to practice the resurrection. And we get this list of four things basically that they do. And what do? But They devote themselves to the apostles' teaching and fellowship. They break bread together, and they pray. Now, I don't know how you receive those words, but when I've heard those words said in church, or sometimes even heard sermons about this text, a very well-meaning preacher will get up and say, oh, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching. And immediately the idea that sort of comes into the head of many audiences is they're learning theology. And they are learning the apostles' teaching. Well, gosh, that must mean the Apostles' Creed. They're learning this stuff about the creeds. And so, okay, what do the creeds say? What does the Apostles' Creed say? And then we go over and we look at the creed, and that's the Apostles' teaching. Okay, so they were learning that. They were in fellowship with one another. When I think of fellowship in a church, I think of the parish hall. And I think of what happens after church on Sunday. I think about having, good church coffee and great cookies after a service. I might think about a Bible study. I might think about a book group. I might think about some other kind of activity, the church picnic. Breaking bread, I think of the Eucharist or the communion service, and prayers. I am an Episcopalian, so I think of the liturgy. You're Congregationalists. You have shared prayers. You have prayers that you say over and over. You have prayers that are written for you in community, and prayers that are written for you by your denomination. You don't do them as regularly as, say, Episcopalians do out of a Book of Common Prayer, but you do have prayers that are part of your tradition. Now, if we think about the fact that the story that we're being told was an event that happened weeks after that very first ever Easter Sunday, it becomes clear that the people who were newly baptized and the people who had just heard about Jesus' resurrection, they didn't have any of this stuff. They didn't have a church. There were no church buildings. There was nothing they could go to and say, oh, I'm now in church. I don't even know that they had that word, church. That when you think about the apostles' teaching, they sure as heck don't have the Apostles' Creed. That doesn't show up until 300 years later. There are no parish halls. There's no church. What do they mean by fellowship? Breaking of bread, well, they're feeding one another, but they probably don't have a thing like we know as Eucharist or the Lord's Supper today. And prayers, what were they praying? They certainly weren't praying from a Book of Common Prayer, and they weren't praying prayers that were written from some official denominational office, or they weren't written prayers that were passed on by, pastors and religious professionals. So what is this stuff? The apostles' teaching, fellowship, breaking bread, and prayers. See, we assume we know what they did, but we don't really. Yet this is how these first believers practiced resurrection. In order to enter into what they did, I just want to draw from a couple little pieces of biblical scholarship and suggest to you that what is happening here is a lot less like a manifesto of going out and working. And it's more like a manifesto of a transformed life in community. And so, the apostles' teaching. What were the apostles teaching to these folks who've heard the very first message? Well, you could look at the book of Acts and you see that they're essentially teaching the salvation history of the Hebrew people, and they're teaching something about Jesus' own life and ministry, and then they teach that he was crucified by the Romans and that he was raised. And that's the apostles' teaching. It's really the story of the Old Testament, the scriptures that they had, and then that was tagged with their experience of who Jesus was and this event of Easter Sunday. There has been a suggestion in recent years that creeds, of course, did develop fairly early in the life of the Christian church, and that the first creeds were relatively simple. Often people hear that the very first creed was Jesus is Lord or He is risen. Those are creedal statements. Those are assertions of belief, not intellectual belief, but of a sort of experiential belief about who Jesus was. Stephen Patterson, who teaches New Testament out on the West Coast, wrote a book about 3 years ago where he looked into this issue of what the first creed might be. And through an incredible amount of historical reconstruction, he came up with this as the first probable baptismal creed of the Christian church, one that was operative within probably a year or two after Jesus had died. And this is the way that first creed went. For you are all children of God. You are all children of God in the Spirit. There is no Jew or Greek. There is no slave or free. There is no male and female. For you are all one in the Spirit. You might recognize those words because Paul will include those words in the book of Galatians, which is one of the earliest books in the New Testament. Galatians was written probably around the year of 40, maybe 42, something like that. So within basically a decade of the time that Jesus was executed by the Roman Empire. And somehow, very early on, these words began to mark the Christian experience. Is that Jesus had broken down the boundaries. Jesus had broken down the boundaries of death, and Jesus had broken down the boundaries that separate us as human beings. Jesus had broken down the walls of, if you listen to the words, Jew and Greek, the walls of ethnic and religious identity, slave and free. Jesus had broken down the walls of economic class, and there is no male and female. Jesus had broken down the walls of gender. And so the first creed is a creed not about Jesus being part of a trinity or being fully human and fully divine. All of that stuff will come much, much later. That's not what the apostles taught. But this shows up so early in Christianity that it seems pretty clear, and I think Patterson makes an incredibly convincing case, that this is the first creed that represents the teaching of the very first generation of the Christian community, of the apostles themselves. It's a creed of human solidarity. For you are all children of God in the Spirit. There is no Jew or Greek. There is no slave or free. There is no male and female. For you are all one in the Spirit. And that makes some sense in relationship to this text, because the text from Acts is a baptismal text. Those people were just baptized. And the case Patterson makes is that the words that were said with those folks at their baptism are those kinds of words, the words of a God who has broken through all of the boundaries of human experience and created a new kind of community. And that is what fellowship is. Fellowship is not a fellowship hall. Fellowship is not just a sort of a loose sort of understanding of how we like each other or serve one another in a church or do nice things together. But instead, fellowship is a boundary-breaking friendship with God. The love of God bursting through. Jesus says, I no longer call you servants, but I call you friends. A friendship between human beings and God, and true friendship, solidarity between all human beings. That friendship manifests itself, as it did in the Gospel of John, with a new meal, with the breaking of bread. sitting at a table of friends, serving one another, without having there be a head of table, serving one another a meal, regardless of social class, a meal that is a foretaste of the banquet of God for the whole of creation. And so what were they praying? We have a pretty good indication of that in the Bible itself. O God, Abba, the one who is Father and Mother of us all, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us today our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Forgive us our debts, as we forgive those who are holding debts against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For yours is the kingdom forever. Amen. That's what they were praying. They were praying to the one who is the Father and Mother of us all, Abba, whose name is hallowed at the center of all of creation. The way that you dream for us to live, dear Abba, may that be manifested here among us on earth. And the way that is manifested is trusting you for daily bread, giving you, offering gratitude and praise, sharing with others, forgiving debts, forgiving those who hold us in debt, being freed from anything that would tempt us or frighten us, being able to resist that which is evil. Those are the prayers. It's an astonishing list. As the apostles' teaching is solidarity between God and all of humanity, fellowship is the manifestation of that solidarity in community. That community serves the whole of the community, a round table with no distinctions of class or race or gender or anything that would separate people, a meal of full, total thanksgiving and liberation. And then the prayers. Oh God, you who have lived in heaven have come among us and bring that kingdom to us. Bring that kingdom to us. Bring that commonwealth among us. And what's the result of this? Well, it says in the next half of the text that the disciples are filled with awe, that there is justice and sharing, economic equality, gratitude, and then finally, others join them. That's the manifesto for practicing resurrection. It's not really a list of committees. It's not a sort of, what can we get out here and do next, you know? It is 4 simple things. A community that understands itself to be a community that is in solidarity with God and neighbor. A community that manifests that solidarity in deep fellowship by being willing to live with one another and express that love in physical and embodied ways. One of those embodied ways is having a meal together. And then finally, it's living a life of prayer that draws its heart out of the way that Jesus taught us how to pray. Practice resurrection. It's not a long to-do list. It's not the work we have to do. It's not a call to exhaust yourself. It's a call to live. It's a call to live as humanly as we possibly can, with and for one another, and for the life of God in the world. Amen.